Well, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Capitalism Without Capital, and very much looking forward to the session today. My name is Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive at CN. My job today is to chair the session and keep us to time. But first of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We're very lucky at the FS Club to have a range of organisations who act as sponsors and enable us to run the range of interesting sessions that we do, both here and in person. As I mentioned, I'm Mike Wardle. Really, my job is to get out of your way very quickly so we can hear from our keynote speaker. And looking at the program today, we've got about a 20-minute presentation from our speaker, Sir John Kay, who I'll introduce properly in a minute, and then some time for Q&A. If you haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way to engage in the Q&A is to find the questions tab on the dashboard on your screen, type in your observation or your question. That'll come to us and we'll field those during the Q&A session at the back end of the webinar. But you can put a question in at any time, so please, if you have a thought or an issue that you want to raise, please do put it into the question tab as soon as you think of it. The session is being recorded today, just so that if you want to go back and take another look, or you have friends and colleagues who you think will be interested in the content, there'll be opportunity to share a link to the recording with them, which will be up on our website within the next 24 hours or so. Even during Easter holiday, I probably ought to promise it for Tuesday rather than tomorrow. That's all by way of housekeeping, I believe. Today's speaker, who I'd like to introduce, is Sir John Kay, Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, one of our leading economists with very wide practical experience in business and finance, the founding dean of Oxford University's Saïd Business School, and held a chair at London Business School. And really, the background to this talk is his recent book, The Corporation in the 21st Century. And he is known very much for his writing about the world of business and finance. And John, really looking forward to your presentation today. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much. To change the subject for a brief moment, when we were planning this presentation earlier in the week, we were looking at the news as it was appearing on the BBC, and it was difficult not to be attracted by this particular image. First slide. Vets say they're under pressure to bring in more money per pet. And of course, the theme which it was about was the way in which vet practices, typically in the part diffused across the country, have been taken over by a small number of firms with private equity funding. And I think we all thought that when we take a pet to a vet, we want someone who cares for the pet rather than someone who is on a target for the number of treatments he or she prescribes in a particular time. If I went further down the page of that news that day, I saw the stuff about Harvard's response to interference of various kinds from the White House and its agents. And for those of us who have been much involved in universities, it was quite difficult not to feel that the people in the White House had a point. It was also not difficult to feel that we didn't want people in the White House running universities instead of the people who are doing it at the moment. And we went back for a moment. Well, we looked at the pictures of people demonstrating outside Tesla showrooms, and we went back a moment last month to the murder of the CEO of United Health in Manhattan, and the extraordinary business that the CEO of a health company was actually the target for popular resentment. The broad point I want to make is that something has gone very badly wrong in the relationships between the public, government, and business. And the whole theme of what I want to argue in this book and others that will follow it are that we need to rethink the relationship between business and society. And when I say that, I don't just mean fiddling, tinkering with the edges of regulation. I mean a cultural change. I mean a reassessment of the relationship between business and society and the ways in which management plays a role both in running business and in the political environment in which they cope. So that's a story which I tell in the book which we're talking about today. And we're talking really about two kinds of changes which have occurred since the times of the Industrial Revolution. There's a change in the physical nature of business and the change in the intellectual way in which we think about business. I want to say a little this afternoon about each of these. If we'd been meeting 100 years ago and looking at business as it was emerging then, we'd have looked at a picture rather like this. We could have the next slide. In the 1920s, Ford Motor Company, run by Henry Ford, was building what was certainly the largest industrial plant in the world then, and it's probably the largest industrial plant there ever will be. It's hard to imagine the sheer size of that River Rouge complex. You could put Hyde Park in it 20 times and still have room left. It was huge, and you can see what it looked like, with steam coming out of chimneys all over the place, and endless shuttles of parts from one part of the complex to another. If I go further another 50 years forward, I see this is General Motors, and this is what General Motors was like, if we can start the video, in the 1970s.
The beating heart of a modern nation. Billions of pounds of steel every year. Millions of pounds of glass and aluminum, of rubber and plastic, of copper and lead and zinc alloys. Millions of yards of fabrics, all being cut and stamped and sewn. Components being readied for assembly. All destined to serve the transportation needs of a modern society that has grown and prospered in large part because of the automobile and what it has allowed people to do. From 20 different fabricating plants they come, from thousands of supplier companies, components of all sizes and shapes, arriving in 26 assembly plants here and in Canada. Each part to be assembled together with the next, quickly, efficiently, until finally there emerges the engineering and manufacturing miracle that is a modern automobile body. One new body every 3 seconds. 1,200 every working hour by one.
Now you can see one or two changes that had occurred. The General Motors was not run by a single individual in the way that the Ford Motor Company was. It was run by a professional management team, which Alfred Sloan had built up. The assembly line, which Ford had pioneered, had been taken to much greater lengths. You can see the extent of globalization, that parts were coming from all over the place in order to make that automobile. But you can also see the ways in which they were being assembled in a single plant in the United States. If we now go on to ask what the modern corporation looks like, we get a rather different picture. We get a picture of this one, in fact. We get Cupertino, which is barely a tenth of the size of the River Rouge site, and you can see, if you look, that 80% of what's in it is grass. If you go inside the buildings, they look something like this. Well, they do look like this, though Apple won't let us photograph the people working in it. That's very important, because that's what they're doing and that's what they're there. That's Cupertino, and it's a very different story, and the product is a very different story either, as we can see in a moment. A lot of people think that a modern business is about more stuff, that growth means more stuff. It's actually quite the opposite. The iPhone, smartphone, which we have in the middle of this slide, takes the place of the atlas, the bookshelf, the fax machine, the telephone, and so on. The point is not that we have more things. The point is not that we have, it's that we have simple things that do a great range of that other devices did, and a variety of things that we never imagined we could have a computer in our pockets to do. But that's the way in which production has changed. And the important thing about production, about this change in the nature of production, is that the value of the product lies primarily in the ideas and thoughts that go into it. The COVID mRNA vaccine is probably the most valuable product we have today. It costs, I reckoned it's about 50 times the price per kilo of gold. What you're buying, however, if you're buying that vaccine, you're buying a manufactured good, and people keep talking about manufacturing. But when they talk about manufacturing, what they have in mind is people working hard until they, at the end of the day, have to go home and shower to take the sweat and dirt of their day's work off their bodies. Modern production is like my slide of Cupertino. It doesn't look like that anymore. That's the physical change. Production has dematerialized, and the means of production have dematerialized. The telephone, the record player, the fax machine, the atlas, the library have been replaced by the smartphone, and the Cupertino has replaced the River Rouge as the center of production. It's the center of global hollow production. That's the physical change which we see. But there's also been an intellectual change. Let's go on to the next slide, and you can see the kind of change that occurred across the latter part of the 20th century. At the end of the Second World War, Boeing had established itself as an aircraft producer. Bill Allen, who was post-war CEO of Boeing, famously said of the company that we aim to eat, breathe, and sleep the world of aeronautics. And that was the company that launched in the 1950s, in the 1960s rather, the 737 short-haul jet, which made low-cost air travel possible and available to a mass audience, and the 747 pioneered intercontinental jet travel and made that an opportunity for people to engage. They changed the world by means of these world-shaking, certainly world-changing inventions. That was Boeing, the Boeing that became, from 1960 to 2000, the world's leading civil aircraft producer. Indeed, the world dominant civil aircraft producer. Its only rivals for that title was really McDonnell Douglas, or had been for some time, and a second rival, of course, which was Airbus in Europe. At the end of the century, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing merged. Technically, of course, formally, that was a takeover of McDonnell Douglas by Boeing, because Boeing was then by clearly the largest and most successful producer. But interestingly, culturally, it was a takeover. It was rather more of a takeover of Boeing by McDonnell Douglas. And McDonnell Douglas had by that time acquired a strong shareholder orientation, so that while Bill Allen's Boeing aimed to eat, breathe and sleep the world of aeronautics, what Phil Conduit's Boeing was a rather different kind of establishment. Boeing decided its headquarters should move from Seattle, which was traditionally the large manufacturing site, to Chicago. And Condit, explaining that change, said when the headquarters is located in proximity to a principal business, as ours was in Seattle, the corporate center is inevitably drawn into day-to-day business operations, clearly something that he thought should be avoided in a large company. And Condit was succeeded as CEO of Boeing by Harry Stonecipher, who was a McDonnell Douglas protege. He'd spent his career there, and he explained, when people say I changed the culture of Boeing, that was the intent. So to run like a business rather than a great engineering firm. It is a great engineering firm, but people invest in a company because they want to make money. As a matter of fact, both Condit and Stonecipher were forced out of Boeing for reasons that had nothing to do with the culture of the company, but much to do with their personal behavior. And the CEO position was taken over by Jim McNerney, who was actually a protege of Jack Welch's at General Electric and had absorbed the General Electric culture. What mattered was shareholder value. And it was that company, Stonecipher's Boeing, that made the decision to, instead of trying to design a new short-haul aircraft to compete with Airbus's immensely successful A320, which you've all been in, instead of competing with the A320 with a new plane, and bear in mind that the first 737 took to the air in 1967, so it's now over 50 years old, they decided to reconfigure the 737 a bit to fit new, more fuel-efficient airlines. And that, of course, was Boeing's 737 MAX, the plane that crashed so disastrously in 2018 and 2019, and managed to crash the share price with it. This isn't, of course, a story just of Boeing and of American companies. It's very much a story of British ones as well. In Britain, in 1990, two leading industrial companies in Britain were ICI and GEC. Neither of these companies still exist. The story of ICI is one which I congratulate myself of first drawing attention to in the mid-1990s, when Tony Blair was talking about stakeholding, and I was asked to a CBI presentation to explain what stakeholding meant. And for that particular talk, I put up ICI's mission statement as it had been for many years and was in the 1980s. ICI aims to be the world's leading chemical company, serving customers internationally through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related science. Through achievement of our aim, we will enhance, I said, the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, customers, and the communities which we serve and in which we operate. That was ICI in the 20th century. And ICI was created in the 1920s by a merger of companies in explosives and dyestuffs. It then, in the 1930s, shifted its focus to petrochemicals and fertilizers, new applications, new examples of the responsible application of chemistry and related science to business. Then, after the Second World War, the company realized that the applications of chemistry and related science were going to be rather different in future. They developed positions in fabrics and in pharmaceuticals. And pharmaceuticals, interestingly, ICI lost money in pharmaceuticals for 20 years, from the end of the Second World War to the 1960s, when ICI scientists discovered what was the first effective drug against hypertension, which were beta blockers. And by the 1980s, the pharmaceutical division had become the main profit driver for the company. But ICI changed its mission statement. The provocation for it was a bid by, or a rumoured bid by Hansen, but it was also the product of the climate of the time. ICI's mission statement in 1994 had become, our objective is to maximise value for our shareholders by focusing on the businesses where we have market leadership, a technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. That, I explained, was the change, and it wasn't for a change for the better. And the stock market, after a time, took a similar view. This is what happened to the ICI share price thereafter. It reached a peak in the spring of 1997. Remarkably, there's a parallel between the fortunes of ICI and the fortunes of Tony Blair, and they both reached a peak in 1997 and declined somewhat thereafter, until in 2007, what remained of ICI, what remained of the company that aimed to create value for its shareholders, was taken over by the Dutch company AkzoNobel. That's the story of ICI. And the story of GEC, I'm afraid, is a very similar story, but on an even more compressed timescale. The attempt to create shareholder value ended up destroying shareholder value, and it did that at both companies. And the reason for that was well illustrated for me, actually in a review of my book by the former English test teacher, Ed Smith, who quoted the title of a couple of books by legendary American football and basketball coaches. The title Walsh gave to his book about football was The Score Takes Care of Itself. And the history of ICI, of GEC, of Boeing, is that if you build a great business, the score takes care of itself. If you build a great business, you create shareholder value. And that's the story which I want to tell. Running business is about professional management that creates business and creates great businesses. And if you create businesses, the share price takes care of itself. That's what happened at Boeing, at ICI, at GEC. That's what happened. Again, effective management is about creating great businesses. And what I want is to take away from all of this is to think not how we create shareholder value, not how we tinker with regulation to make it more relevant or more effective. It's how we actually change the culture of how business relates to society, and the way in which the great businesses that were created at ICI, at Boeing, at GEC, and so on, how these businesses actually serve the communities in which they operate. What we've seen is a paradoxical world in which, on the one hand, capital has actually become less significant to business as production has dematerialized, but capital market activity has greatly increased in volume, most of it based on trading in existing assets. That's what went wrong with the vet product practices I was describing, and that's what's gone wrong on a much bigger scale in relation to some of these great companies I've been talking about. Thank you.
Well, John, thank you very much indeed for setting out the the overview there. And we've got quite a few questions have come in during your presentation. Audience, there's obviously time to put in further questions as we go forward. But first of all, Dan Feeney is turning to the topic of the moment, I think. He said, assuming that putting a tariff on global trades and goods doesn't make sense to you, given your research in the past, where do you sit on tariffs and what's going on at the moment in world trade?
It's difficult to contribute to debate whose terms and language change every day. There has been a role for tariffs in industrial development, which have been deployed effectively by some of the East Asian countries in the last 20 or 30 years. But the great achievement of many of the companies we've been talking about, archetypally actually, the Ford and General Motors we looked at, has been the development of globalization and exploitation of competitive advantage to ensure that products can be produced around the world at lowest cost. And this current tariff discussion seems to me a rather unintelligent substitute for physical aggression. It's good that it's a substitute for physical aggression, but that doesn't make it good in itself.
Thank you very much. Martin White has got a couple of questions, which is, first of all, asking if you were to revise your book, The Long and the Short of It, are there any changes in your view of the prospects for investing in company shares? Or how have your views developed since you wrote the book, given the changing nature of business?
Well, we've been working on a revised edition of that, which will, I hope, answer Martin's question. But the largest change, I think, there isn't a fundamental change in the investment philosophy, which I would describe. But what I've learned much more clearly since then is is the ways in which shareholder value is built indirectly in the way I described. That shareholder value is the product of creating great businesses, and that's directs one even more forcefully to the idea that what we're looking for as investors is professional managers of great businesses. It's not about plans of mergers and acquisitions and the things which so often pass for so-called strategy in the presentations of consultancies of various kinds.
Thank you very much. Ian Harris from TN has asked, what are your thoughts on the changing pattern of comparative advantage in world trade, with the shift towards manufacturing advantage in Asia and services advantage in the West? And you hypothesize that a shift from innovation and engineering to business and corporate orientation has been the downfall of several major Western corporations. But where does the shifting sands of comparative advantage fit in the reshaping of capitalism?
I think it's a misunderstanding to think that comparative advantage in manufacturing has shifted somewhere else, and that's why Western corporations have declined. Western corporations have not declined. And part of this, actually, and this is an interesting aspect on the question, is that it's an issue of the way in which we measure things. A number of people have come up recently with criticisms of GDP measurement as a means of measuring economic progress. And I hope I've illustrated that rather well by the examples I cited of the COVID vaccine and the smartphone, both of which are immensely world-changing, and my productivity has increased dramatically as a result of the smartphone and the internet. Very little of that actually shows up in GDP. This dematerialization of production means we measure economic activity, much of which is now in the heads of people and on their screens. We don't measure it very well. It's a set of measures that were devised for a world that consisted of much of the conventions of calculating GDP were developed during the Second World War, where what you wanted to know were how many tanks and planes came off the end of the production line. And it isn't like that anymore. What's behind all this kind of question, in part, is the idea that real economic activity is about manufacturing. And I've been trying to argue against that from various different directions in what I've been saying. The value of modern products is the ideas that go into them, not the actual physical labor itself. And what has disappeared from many Western cities is the manual labor, which used to be the basis of economic activity. It's actually a curiously gendered observation, because the jobs that are regarded as real work in these terms are jobs that were traditionally done by men, hewing coal, making steel, and so on, and men indeed working in large plants and large factories. That isn't what business is like anymore. Modern business is very often like Apple, a hollow corporation. The corporation is the coordinator of a range of capabilities, which will be in different places, in different and of different kinds. And the Apple smartphone, it's as we know, assembled in mainly in mainland China by Foxconn, which is a subsidiary of the Taiwanese Honhai Industries. But what Foxconn does accounts for typically $20 of a $500 to $1,000 smartphone. The largest producer of components that go into smartphone is actually, bizarrely, Samsung, who are Apple's principal rival in making smartphones. That's the change that has occurred in production, and the change in which steel is now made in Korea and China, not in the United States and Luxembourg, is a change which, my perception, we should welcome. And indeed, those manual labour jobs which will remain will be the manual labour jobs which are most open to replacement by robots and machines.
I mentioned Martin White had a couple of questions. His second question is really about how we change culture. How can we encourage companies to run themselves in such a way that they are more likely to survive in the longer term, as opposed to chasing short-term results? And perhaps you could write a book on it, he suggests.
Right. He could, and I think the several books I've written are all, as it were, can be combined into that book. I think what he's talking about there, or the essence of what he's talking about there, is really about the influence which investors should have on business, and that, in the terms I've been describing, is that the companies they invest in should be people who are building great businesses. The Boeing of 1940 to 2000, rather than the Boeing of 2000 to 2020, and it's shifting corporate the so-called pursuit of corporate social responsibility from the issues of carbon emissions and the like, which have preoccupied concerned investors over the last decade, into building a real business that has the kind of mission statement that we had from 1987 for ICI. ICI is about the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. And the way they put it, and this is right, through achievement of our aim, we will enhance the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, our customers, and the communities which we serve, all our stakeholders. And in doing so, we will certainly create shareholder value. That was a story of an earlier phase of economic development, and we need to make it that story again.
Thank you. Andrew Watson has dug out Sir Bill Gates's comments on reviewing Capitalism Without Capital when it was written back in 2018. Bill Gates said at the time the portion of the world's economy that just doesn't fit with the old model keeps getting larger, which has major implications for everything from tax law to economic policy, to which cities thrive and which fall behind. But in general, the rules that govern the economy haven't kept up. Do you think that's still the case and getting worse, or still the case and perhaps has been responded to in a way?
No, I think it's still the case. And the whole thesis behind my book is that the language we use to talk about business is a language which was developed for the businesses of the Industrial Revolution. At the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution began with ironworks, with textiles, mills, developed into automobile plants and so on. It was physical production of expensive, resource-intensive products. That's not what the world is like anymore. As that story is just telling us, it's the value of products have moved away from the stuff that goes into it to the ideas that go into it. And that's a change that's only going to go further as time develops.
Thanks very much. Lynn Brooks has asked for your thoughts about what you feel the future is for the cooperative form as we're resolving some of those shareholder dilemmas and a shift into a more equitable model in the way that companies address society.
I think you get a very good answer to that in the Miners' report on why essentially the cooperative movement in the UK had declined since its formation in the mid-19th century. And that is, it more and more was governed by people whose interest was not in serving customers and doing the kind of things the ICI statement did, but in pursuing a variety of political agendas of various kinds, which actually ended up not serving customers' needs pretty well. And that's true at one level of Elon Musk, and at the other of well-intentioned people who want to give ESG metrics to companies or to people who are happy to serve on cooperative boards. The businesses that are run well are the businesses that are run by dedicated professional managers. And we need to think about how we hold them accountable for what they're doing. And that's a question I think we need to answer, but answer better than we have. But I'm not sure that the cooperative movement, cooperative of whom? I'm not sure the cooperative movement answers that well.
Thank you very much. Nikki Holthausen and Andrew Ross have got linked questions really about how we are dealing with the question of corporate contribution to climate change and why the fact of climate change hasn't fundamentally changed corporate approaches. And so there's two things. There's one, how do we deal with corporations and their contribution to climate change, but why hasn't it actually changed behavior anyway?
Right. There are, as you say, linked questions there. I have to say, I think the climate change is a real phenomenon, but a wildly exaggerated one. It is not the case that climate change is bringing the world as we've known it to an imminent end. I think there is a great deal we should do to reduce carbon emissions. But the main thing we will do to reduce carbon emissions is actually to develop new technologies for electricity production and generation. And it's not by the kind of virtue signaling, which is so much of the concern of climate change. Climate change warriors at the moment. What Britain contributes to global carbon emissions is extremely small. And what matters in reducing these emissions in the future is what happens to energy generation in Africa, Asia, as these countries develop their economies. That's what we should be focusing on. And that's what Britain actually has an international competitive advantage in doing, in developing new technologies, rather than in making gestures of various kinds.
Thank you very much. Delphine is turning to AI. I mean, AI being the technology that's going to
At the moment, yeah.
modern workplace, generative AI in particular. We've been doing AI for a long time. But his question is really about the teaching of students. Are today's students being taught the proper mindset which will lead to their success, given that AI is giving tools that are going to change the way everything happens?
Well, I think the AI story again is another one where people are enormously exaggerating the short-term impact of AI, but possibly underestimating and misunderstanding the long-run impact. I go back to the dot-com boom at the turn of the century, and there's so much of that experience that seems to resonate today. Even down to the Magnificent Seven on the stock market. It's hard to believe now that the most valuable company in the world in 2000 was Cisco, which made, of course, routers that gave people internet access. And Cisco is a company that is still around, but if you sold your Cisco shares today, you would just about get your money back if you bought them in 2000. People tend to overestimate the short-term significance of these things with rather little understanding of how they will change things in the long run. The internet has made a huge difference to the way business is conducted, the way we live our lives, but we didn't understand in 1999 what that change was going to be.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one last question before we close. Andrew Watson has asked what your thoughts are about accounting for value creation in the post-industrial economy. If accounting is the DNA of capitalism, I think Andy Haldane said that. The balance sheet today seems to have lost its asset and liability strands. Where do you think? How do you think we account for value in the modern economy, or are we doing that successfully yet?
It's funny, I agree with Andy on most things, but not on that one. I think, the problem here is that we're trying to quantify too much. We have this idea that if we can't, that only things that can be quantified count, and that is absolutely wrong. And if I go back to my slide at the beginning of showing the vet with the cat in her arms, that is the sort of thing that real economic growth is about. And to turn that into metrics of how many treatments you do is something that is immensely destructive, not just of our welfare, but actually of our economic development.
Well, thank you very much. Time has beaten us, but I'd like to thank you for both your fascinating talk and your very thoughtful answers. Before we finish, just finally to thank our sponsors once again for supporting the FS Club and enabling us to run these, and looking ahead to our next events. Next Wednesday, Fewer Rules, Better People, Why Discretion Makes for Better Decision Makers. On Thursday, the launch of the Global Green Finance Index 15. On Wednesday, the 30th of April, Taiwan's AI-driven financial innovation and digital transformation. So plenty of content coming up. Do keep an eye on the website to see what's coming. It just remains for me to thank you, the audience, for your participation, for your questions, for your engagement, but mainly to thank John for your fascinating talk and your very thoughtful answers. It's been great, and we look forward to seeing you again, perhaps when the next book comes out. So thank you very much indeed for this afternoon's presentation.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.